Hello. So I'm going to share a talk through which I'm actually share part of my journey and the transformation I'm getting through, so I don't expect certainties and ready-to-use options within that, but I would like to engage you in that journey and get to share questions that we might resolve all together. There are many definitions of design. The most commonly used is the one from Herbert Simon that says design is about improving situations into preferable ones. We all share that, and of course design thinking is a proxy about that, but this is much older. There's also some definitions that are more disturbing, and if you look at when they were presented back in 1994, we could argue that it's actually still very true for design in general, including digital technologies. We are impacting the world in ways that probably are beyond what we would like to be discussed. There's one definition I'm trying to commit to, which is the one from Alain Findely, which says that the aim of design is to improve or at least maintain the ability of the world in every dimensions. This is a pretty big perspective, but when you look at the detail throughout the presentation I'm going to get through, there are things that design can really achieve into that. The first thing is that same Alain Findely also said that if you abstract object being a product or a service, then you can get to a bigger level, which is processes. We've discussed somehow throughout the presentations this morning and discussed also a little bit about the next layer, which is about facilitating discussions between actors, which lead to the questions about ethics. This diagram is really, really essential because what it says is what's been said throughout the movement of cybernetics, and Maturana especially said design is all about conversation. Conversation facilitated through creation of archetypes, of artifacts, to get people to debate and get things done. And if it's about conversation, I mean, within the cybernetics movement, there's actually even more interesting elements that we should consider to raise the quality of our practice today. Key concepts I keep in mind from cybernetics is that everything is a conversation. Everything has to relate to certain context, relationship, and intersubjectivity. You need to think from a system level and include the design thinking for the human factor into that. And then engage whoever stakeholders by creating affordances to help sense, reflect, act. Ultimately, of course, these systems are meant to be diachronic, meaning they will evolve through feedback loops, which leads to the last point, and the most important one, is meta-design. The practice of meta-design came throughout the cybernetics movement, and it was framed to really help reflect on the governance of a smart system. Even more than that, it was meant to include every stakeholder into the conversation. You really have to read that through carefully, because when you read that, it really questions how good are we doing as designers today. Because stakeholders, more often than not, expand beyond what a company might consider as the direct stakeholders. And most often than not, the externalities of projects are not included in that, and stakeholders that might have a say in the reason for a project to exist don't have a voice. And more than that, meta-design never anticipated the scale of platforms such as the one as Facebook, with 2.4 billion users with only one centralized governance. No one anticipated this, and the meta-design theory covered the questions of how do we arrange the governance, but it was kind of considered as being the space for an expert community within the project to decide as experts for the rest from the early phase of the cybernetics. But that doesn't scale, as we know from what happened for big companies like Facebook and others. And I see design stretched in two directions now, pulled down into short and fast cycles on one hand, and into governance and ethics on the other hand. I wrote about that, and I explored what could be meta-design if we really considered that space to include a broader set of stakeholders. I explored that and published a paper on it to question what if someone, like in the example in my paper, joining Facebook could come with his own set of ethics, or being part of a community, a subset of what is Facebook, and eventually agree together on a subset of values to iterate from. I'm teaching that at Sciences Po. I'm teaching meta-design in the Grand Challenges in the School of Management of Innovation. And I gave last year my students a simple project. I asked them, what if we would develop an alternative to Amazon where the governance would be embedded in the system, and every participant could have a say on what is worth being promoted for purchase or not, which led to many debates on what are we going for, a global approach, or how do we value a smaller scale? And what is the right small scale? Is that a city? Is that a community of experts? And how does these relate to each other, and how the debate is organized? But all that being within the system, not having a governance for the system, but embedded within the system. I've been involved much earlier, back in 2006 and 2007, in clarifying what Nokia stands for. Nokia is about connecting people, but back at that time, the question was, can we improve and rationalize the design process on one hand, and on the other, improve the quality of what Nokia delivers? And through iterations, I did develop a framework that would eventually ignore the short-term portfolio, but focus on certain qualities that Nokia would deliver, whatever the product would be to come, and also the design process. So I started to get engaged into questions of how can we really help design get in a better direction without being prescriptive in micro-managing guidelines, but much rather starting to frame what the company should stand for and some form of mission. I applied that to generative tools back in the days in Nokia in 2006, trying to frame what Nokia could stand for in the case of the potential re-emergence of artificial intelligence. Just to frame the context, AI came back fashionable again in 2012, but back in 2006 it was quite in the winter still. And the assumption was that when we have ability to have decentralized processing, a massive increase of data sensors, and full-time connection, the whole business model would change. And Nokia would not try to do AI that dehumanized, but put the human right in the middle. And we explore interdependencies, and we got into the theory and the literature about animism. And we built a framework that was quite holistic and comprehensive that led to 120 innovations, and articulated a way to frame a culture to empower designers to deliver. But still, throughout these experiences, I asked myself, are we really up to the challenge that we claim of Findeli? Are we really doing that, at least for myself? And the answer is not black and white, especially if you take the phenomenology of perception from Merleau-Ponty. He's standing for the idea that we are not rational, and everything is about intersubjectivity, and we all carry our own prejudices, and technology somehow, as we know now, amplifies these more than reduces these for now. When we reflect on how people engage with a new service by sensing what's going on to reflect and act, more often than not, we're short-circuiting this model by just covering two of these, like I'm sensing and I'm acting. And we are underdeveloping the ability to help people reflect on their actions, and that feedback loop somehow, in most cases, don't exist. When we talk, as this morning we mentioned design thinking, the triangle of desirable, viable, feasible is kind of fairly misused somehow. When we cover the desirability, we end up having a company discussing what's the best way to get my client to buy a car, rather than question whether this car is desirable in the first place, because desirability is covering the end user that might be the one buying or paying the service, but we rarely integrate in the question people that might not desire the car to exist in the first place. And so we got trapped into that system somehow to encourage a model of innovation that I would question as very desirable. This morning you've seen this slide and the promise of Dieter Rams to frame what good design is and how it's been misused, which is quite disturbing in some respect, because it's fairly accurate. Even further than that, a former colleague of mine in Nokia, Adam Greenfield, published a really good book called Everywhere, where he tries to frame the key principles to develop a better interactive systems. And most likely, no services can fit to these principles today. It is still quite disturbing. So it was back in 2006, anticipating the data economy that only came about around 2009 and this is extremely relevant. So what is wrong in the process? I can't really get into the detail in the time, but if we get into design manifestos, there are many from designers, but I'm getting disturbed by their nature, as from my point of view, none of them stand to the actual contemporary challenges. So it looks like we have a problem. If we take it from the definition of Anthropocene, which is, for those who are not familiar with the idea, is that the impact as the human species we have on the planet is so big now that the scale of what we have to include within the project and the problem we frame, it reached a scale that we are not yet familiar with. It implies addressing complex system thinking and include externalities that most often we totally ignore. And from my point of view, it challenges our very own design practice and the way it is misused for consequences that we should reflect on more. And there's only 3 trends that really matter to help that move forward: resilience, which deals with ecology; equity, which deals with the social; and freedom, which deals with democracy. All of these 3 topics are being under threat now, and these trends will only grow if we don't engage in trying to change some of that. You're probably all familiar with the Meadows report done by the MIT back in the 70s, right? Saying that we live in a world that is finite, with resources that are limited, and we are growing thanks to the overuse of non-renewable energy that demultiply our power, but that will get to an end at some point. And when that gets to an end, we will enter in a phase where we're going to have to reflect on some form of resilience. Jean Covici says, basically, to make the picture clearer, there is a direct correlation between the GDP and energy consumption. To make the things even clearer, one man legs is about 100 watts. One truck is 4,000 kilowatts. So these energies is all about developing our ability to have a better lifestyle and quality and demultiply our own energy. The problem is that in every way we measure performance, the cost of the energy source is always excluded. And more difficult than that, actually, he claims that 100% renewable energy for our energy needs today is impossible. And if we were to use 100% renewable energy, we would have to decrease our lifestyle quality by 5 to 20 times, which is pretty severe. And the consequences being on threat on democracy, geopolitics, reduction of living standard, and reduction of population. The way I see it is like Anthropocene is kind of misdefined. We should call it enterprise of Sen, because all of these are consequences of industrial practices. Professor Buff says that these are the 7 topics that are serious threats for us right now. So industrial agriculture, lack of drinkable water, fishery endangered, deforestation, full of biodiversity, toxic product dissemination, and the last one that he thinks is not even fixable anymore, the climate change. Bruno Latour has tried to frame the political perspective in that and said, we used to be in a world where there was a polarity between the local and the global that now is switching to a new dynamic, very interesting to get into, to understand what to do next, which is some politicians promising a world that will never exist anymore versus some that will relocalize activities and act on some form of resilience with the perspective of limited resources. That changed completely the perspective of every political groups and how we deal with projects and how we include externalities in every project we deal with. We're in a phase where the most advanced designers consider that sustainable development is not the topic anymore. It's too late. We are now in the phase where we need to reflect on some form of resilience. And how do we organize the resilience when things will downscale seriously? Now, in France, recently, back in June, there's been a vote that has modified the civil code to transform companies. This is potentially the biggest opportunities for designers, and hopefully not a new CSR washing, and I'll get into the detail of that. The context is a multi-factor. The young generation is not inspired anymore to join big companies because they find their job really meaningless. Governance of companies is essentially managed by shareholders and have more power than CEOs. Shareholders value short-term performance, essentially financial performance, ignoring any form of externalities. While the reality is that the dividends are social for the best or the worst externalities. And that means there is a need to transform the governance and the business model of companies. It is not about corporate social responsibilities anymore, about claiming and communicating about trying to do good, but to really embed that in a very action you do every day. And Kevin Levillain, who built a thesis on that, is claiming that innovation is all about legal constraint, and there's a competition for that. So, well, you might say, we're not going to change capitalism, are we? If you look at history, there is a hope. There used to be a time where there used to be guilds, and you could not create a company without relying on a community that had a shared goal. Only later came a focus on production, where innovation turned into accounting and optimization and terrorism and corporate paternalism. Then some human element came into that, especially after World War I, where we started consider the human factor, especially because of people being damaged by the war. They had one leg less, so how could they work on the workstation? Then human factor came in the loop. And then it developed with models to frame just-in-time production to clean production. In the 90s, client became part of the process. And then very recently, ISO 24000 for green development. And in the US, a very interesting initiative, the Benefit Corporation in 2010 and 2012, a flexible purpose corporation that was meant to help startups to commit to their mission, whoever would come and fund the company or buy the company, and help them commit to that on the long term. And in France, recently, in 2019, there's been a vote to help companies to become mission companies and extend the governance. You're probably familiar with some American models like the B Corp. Many people think B Corp is about having a label and reaching the threshold and to have your label. Actually, B Corp companies say the reason why I'm in the B Corp is to be part of a community that will share value and will collaborate together to do a better job. That, to me, frames a very interesting perspective of what a company stands for, what it used to be on its own, and how now it reflects on its very needed interdependencies to progress and do better good, not just on their own, but from within a community. The way the law has been framed in France is that it's multi-layered. One is you have to define a raison d'être, a reason to be, and it has to be signed by the board. That means that shareholders that will challenge the short-term performance will not be able to do this anymore because they signed and agreed on the mission that you commit to follow. That means there's also a coherent governance that is open to externalities. So now if you produce something, you have to include the context and parties that are eventually against the project and have a say into that. So it's opening the governance and challenging the redesign of the business model. It has to integrate externalities, and it has to commit to the three performance of financial, ecological, and social. And that can translate in a set of missions that the company signs for and be tracked for its performance on. But how do we frame missions? There are a few frameworks that you can start considering. You're probably familiar with the one from the United Nations, the 17 goals, right? Especially since that the United Nations Global Impact has published 800 criteria to evaluate your performance in committing to deliver to that. What you should keep in mind in any way is that you could not cover just one against the benefit of the others. And the main message today is that you should try to commit to the whole set because it's a holistic perspective. I personally use the ARUPS model. You can find it on iTunes. It's ARUPS Driver of Change. It's very well designed, and the 17 topics are reduced to 10, and it's very well framed to help you include all these 10 challenges within every single project you develop. It's a very practical work, and ARUP has actually, so there's another example of a think tank from the UK that is trying to map the interdependencies of the problems that you should embed in the projects. It's a profound change. Even if you're in a very good company with a clear mission, here I'm using the case of Carl Zeiss. Carl Zeiss governance is really well thought and has managed to get the company throughout various crises and still be reaching for excellence. But when you look at these 6 principles, they are outdated if you take the context I've framed. So even the best ones are not aligned to what's to come. So then the other difficulty is that we're not born equal, And you can't ask a company to reach the Everest if most of the resources can't even reach the first base camp. There's a test I'm using, which is called the Garrett CTT. This test helps you ask in a company questions about moral values for an individual, ask them to project that for the company they work for and the company as it might become. When you have these three answers for a panel, you get the moral compass of the company. And if the compass is very low, that doesn't mean you can't help them go up the ladder, but you have to get to understand where people are yet to get to move up, because not everyone are prepared for a very important mission. And the question is being clear on where they stand to help them move up easier. This is my result. We could debate on that, but I've done the test, and if you do that throughout an organization, the results are very, very different, and that's the ground to start from. There's a framework I found interesting. Kevin Levillain, who worked on that community, who got the law passed in France, has proposed a matrix that is an option for the ladder. He gives 4 options. One is your mission is about supporting restrictive knowledge and restrictive relationship, like preserving a library. Expanding knowledge, restrictive knowledge and expansive relationship, it's a distribution mission, like develop access to the bottom of the pyramid. Expansive knowledge and restrictive relationship, it's a generative mission, like reinvent libraries. And the 4th one, a generic mission, expansive knowledge, expansive relationship, is about working on common potential with yet along the process unknown constraint to all work on, like what's the future of AI should be, for example. I'm engaged in a community in the French government called 10% to Change All, that is going to present sometime around October, November, a plan to help French companies transform. I'm involved in framing the manifesto in that, and the key 3 topics articulating all the elements are these ones. Helping improving prosperity through inclusive governance of companies, helping resilient territories and responsible production, helping on the ecology by addressing all the elements of global warming and preservations of the commons. And the 3rd one, addressing the social element with inequalities, health, and inclusion. Yet, there are still many, many philosophical perspectives within that. Those 2 people who collaborated are completely on the opposite diagram. Umberto Maturana, he's into system thinking, while Francisco Varela is into a more holistic view, quite almost a religious view on how to move forward and share common goals. If you want to explore what it means to think about complexity, in France, we rely on Edgar Morin, which says that we should not ignore complexity, we should embrace complexity. Of course, it's worth reading Margaret Mead as well, and Francesco Varela are good references to build your thinking from. What are the perspectives for designing that? I think that mission-driven companies is potentially the best opportunity to commit to the definition I'm interested in of improving or maintaining the ability of the world. And that's something I would like us together to keep thinking about. Here are 7 assumptions. One is that companies are still a major force for change. Second assumption, mission-driven companies are all about redefining the business model and the organization of the company. Third assumption, every company can walk up the steps, but as I said, you need to be very clear on where they stand and how could you get them to move up. It's all about ecosystems and interdependencies. A company cannot think for themselves on their own and think, I'm doing good, I'm fine. The B Corp is the best example I have in mind of people joining not for the label, but to collaborate. I stand with the idea that digital technology can help ecosystem of actions. And I think mission is the best opportunity for design, but design needs to question its practice and how it is being misused against this common benefit somehow. When I talk about IT, if you step back, Forbes shared a paper where they said that basically the big transformation of digital technology started with the first processor back in '71, and they tried to map what's really going on when there is technology disruption. Okay? One framework I find very interesting is that there's always a phase where it's very messy, the benefit is not clear, and there are certain phenomena that work on their own, and there's a crisis. And then comes the maturity of development. And the assumption in that paper is that actually when we talk about digital technologies, we are not yet into that new phase. I believe that digital technology could really help us, at least for a while, to transition to something much preferable. And we could then use technology for a better good and frame it accordingly. There's an interesting phenomenon. In France, some talk about collapsology, which is the theory of the world collapsing as from what's been said in Meadow's report, and that was something quite French. But last week, famous writer, Jonathan Franzen, who predicted the attack on the Twin Towers, has published a paper saying actually he sort of stands for collapsology, saying we should not deny anymore the situation and move on, and then he develops what does that really mean for him and for us as a community. Meaning that what was something quite local in the French culture is broadening, and in the US this topic is getting picked up by people that were not yet in that space. So how to proceed? The key question is really what's the scale if we have to think broader. Institut des Futurs Souhaitables in Paris is doing prospective on that, and their proposal is to focus on cities. That's debatable, but the complexity of the city ecosystem is broad enough to have a major change and lead to major change. And then apply system thinking in really understanding how to reframe that is worth starting from. Arup, that I mentioned before, is doing a fantastic work for the program of 100 cities resilience. So like cities around the world that are reflecting on how to become resilient. And Arup, that is, for those who don't know, an architecture agency that is doing like architecture in engineering, but it's much more than that now. They have developed a framework with 12 goals, and these 12 goals really help cities articulate how to move forward and reflect on how to get each city more resilient. And their toolkit, that is open source, is really worth knowing. I encourage you also to explore the way to reframe business models and have a look at the new code. The new code is a project built by a private investor guy who's been working more than 20 years on how companies get to structure their financial model. How do they get money and how do they operate? And he's very knowledgeable, and in that so much that he flipped the system and say, could there be a much, much ethical way to reframe the whole way money comes and go and help the company perform? I really encourage you to go and look at that because I find it very interesting. So this is the call to action I want to share with you. I'm really interested in growing a community, engaging in designing mission-driven companies and develop relevant raison d'être and missions. And I really do believe that raison d'être is not just about communication and PR, it's really about reframing why the company exists and what it should stand for, including the elements I've framed about the governance and the business model and what is it to have something to operate with. Somehow, it's the 100 years of the Bauhaus. Isn't that a good opportunity for us designers to question what's the Bauhaus 2.2? Should we question the limit of our own practices? Should we update our knowledge to better perform and commit to what we stand for? Thank you very much. If I have time left, I might have time for questions. How much time is left for questions?
We have 15 minutes for questions.
15 minutes. I went too fast, sorry.
Oh, very nice. Well done.
Maybe I went too fast on the slides. If you want to go back and maybe challenge the point of view.
One question. Thank you.
Thank you. Why do you mention Bauhaus? Can you explain why you mention Bauhaus?
Well, because the Bauhaus had the ambition to improve people's life and some would argue, was the beginning of design. And connecting art with industry was part of that, but also improve people's life. There's a fantastic 6 movies series built by French-German TV Arte that re-summarized the mission of the Bauhaus, and that was about social inclusion. It was the first school where women could come and study, which has been serious debate within the school itself. Many artists refuse women to come and do anything but designing dresses and not being painting or any applied art for furniture, etc. So that school was incarnating somehow a first ambition for design, and I think we have to revisit what we've done so far and question whether we can commit to the definition we would like to stand for, or whether we're just here to help business keep going as usual.
Hi. I really liked that you were saying that the country sets now a frame for companies to define their mission. Can you line this a little bit more in detail, line out in detail? Are all companies now obliged to set this up?
Okay.
Is there kind of clarity, and like what kind of mission do they set? I mean, they, you know, just more richness to this wonderful new dimension. And how can designers, how can we leverage this if we maybe work for a French company?
Yeah. Well, maybe I step back on that. I can tell you that the law has been passed in France, but there are things considered in Italy, as far as I know, and throughout the world, everyone is trying to move in the same direction. It might not translate in a similar way, whether through a law somewhere or through different culture, but France is not alone. It's kind of been inspired by what happened first in the US, as I said, with the Flexible Purpose Corporation. Now, the way the law is framed in France is like it's multi-layered. First, you could decide to only have a raison d'être signed by the board. Second is that you could reframe your governance, and then third is you can commit to certain missions. It's not yet legally binding. You commit to the board, to people who sign for that, and you include externalities in the governance, but there's no legal enforcement in regards of the performance. Not every companies are forced to go that. They can choose to get there, and now the government is trying to influence and inspire companies to switch there. There's already some that were naturally mission companies that got there first, like some insurance companies that are really thinking deep into how their business model and their ethics are improving, connected to each other, so that insurance companies, for example, when you have to repair a damaged car after an accident, they will encourage you to get through a network of spare parts that already exist locally, rather than get a brand new spare parts produced, for example. So they're addressing every single case to see, can we reduce every impact everywhere and question what we're doing. Maïf also, which is a catalog of products for public servant is also considering how to reframe the portfolio of product and what it means to produce differently and ship differently. But without the context of mission companies, I know that some companies in Sweden, like IKEA, are starting to question the way they produce and ship things as well. So France has decided to do it by law. In some companies, in some countries, might not go that route. The benefit of the law is, for the French culture, a very strong symbol, because when you change the civic code, that means the government really commit into supporting a direction, if I answer your question. There are more, if your question is about the practical steps to get into that, there's only very few examples, because it's so new. Many people even question what are the best practices to write a raison d'être, to organize the governance, and to organize the missions. It's thought in process at the moment.
I have a question. What's your favorite mission statement? Out of all the companies out there doing really well in this field, is there one that really stands out for you that could be aspirational for the rest of us?
I would turn the question back to the audience.
Any good examples? No? There we go.
I got the opportunity to work with Patagonia, the B Corp, recently. And I think healing a broken food system is pretty awesome, and that's what they've committed to. Healing a broken food chain. And they're going to still be a for-profit. They're a B Corp, but they're going to build a community of partners, farmers, others who are involved in regenerative agriculture. So we're way beyond sustainable, way beyond reduce, reuse, recycle. I wanted to ask you, regenerative business design.
Yes.
Are you hearing that meme coming up, and what does that mean to you? Like Dr. Carol Sanford's written a book about it, and this is what Patagonia is really into, that the process rejuvenates the soil, makes it better.
Yes, yes, that's what I meant when I talked about sustainable development. Regenerative business is actually the next thing. That sustainable development is like business as usual, improved to look green, but doesn't result really fixing the system. So when I talked about resilience, somehow I could have developed on that. Is a very good point. Of course, Patagonia is a great example, and Patagonia is the co-founder of B Corp. So in the first place, they are completely committed to have a collaboration to fix the problem, not on their own, but animate a community to together get a problem solved. Yeah.
Any more comments to share before moving on? Well, then I suggest we give Remy a warm hand of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.